All right.
Started, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, friends. And for those who are elsewhere, that is good afternoon, good morning, all of you. Wish you a very, very, warm welcome to this program. This edition of the Learners Program is very, very important for us because we have a very highly distinguished professor with us, and all of us should lend our ears to listen to the professor. And therefore, I have a few announcements, housekeeping announcements, so that our program is effective and all of us benefit best out of this. Since this is an online program, I think your attention is important. Please get glued to your screens and mute your microphone. We will have some 10 to 15 minutes of time towards the end of the program to answer the questions if there are any, and therefore please do not interrupt the distinguished professor unless the professor asks any question. Please do not interrupt, and as far as possible you can keep your video on. That makes the entire program very lively. Post your questions in chat box only. We have got quite a few participants, and therefore it may not be possible for us to invite you to speak individually. Therefore, kindly post your questions in the chat box. As far as possible, we'll try to get the answers from the distinguished speaker. The recording of this program will be available on the YouTube in a day or so. So some of you are not able to get the best out of the best quality out of it. We'll be posting the recording on the YouTube. Then we will first start with the welcoming speech. Then Dr. Anand Reddy would be introducing the distinguished guest speaker. Then the speaker would be speaking to us for about 50 to 55 minutes. Then about 10 minutes for question and answer. And the our secretary, Dr. Srinivas Rao, will propose a vote of thanks towards the end of the program. So let me formally welcome once again distinguished Professor Wyene Brockbank, distinguished members of the National Council of ISTD spread across the country, distinguished professors, deans, directors, HR leaders, trainers, research scholars, students, and my colleagues on the managing committee of ISTD Hyderabad. A hearty welcome to this edition of the Learners Program. I'm fully aware that we are going through the tough times the mankind has ever gone through in the last 100 years or so. And particularly for India, this is the toughest time because we are recording about 400,000 cases per day. But tough times never last long, but tough people do last. And since we are all involved in managing human resources, we have twin responsibilities in our respect to organizations, to be internally motivated ourselves, and also to keep motivating our teams and our human resources. The pursuit of excellence, therefore, continues despite the odds that we are facing. I'm immensely grateful to Professor Brockbank for agreeing to deliver a session on HR's competitive advantage, leveraging information in the learning cycle, which is timely and useful. I'm sure all of us would have many takeaways at the end of this session. Once again, I welcome you all, and without much ado, I hand over the floor to Professor Wyene Brockbank. Sir, over to you. Before that, Dr. Anand Reddy will have a small introduction. I know it takes a long time to introduce because you have got so many achievements, but then we wanted to make it small and short and then give more time to your speech. So over to Anand.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Brockbank, a clinical professor of business at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. And as Dr. Bhaskar Rao sir has said, it takes long time to introduce sir. So instead of reading his profile, I would like to read out what Dave Ulrich has written to me about Professor when I requested for him to address. His mail reads as, I am going to refer to you, Professor Wyene Brockbank. He is my closest professional colleague and has been a professor at the University of Michigan for 30 years. He is a brilliant thinker and presenter, but most important, he has had over 125 visits to India, where he has trained and advised many of the senior Indian business leaders. The government has been so impressed by his work that they issued a postal stamp in his honor, and he is a delightful colleague. So I am going to recommend him as your guest. He knows intimately the Indian leadership setting and will be of great value to your audience. So with these great words from a great person about the great person, over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. And I didn't have to pay Dave very much to have him write that. That was very kind. And thank you for that. By the way, here's a, he mentioned that stamp. Here's the stamp. And this was issued, I think you can see it. Anyway, that's the stamp. And that was given to me on my last trip to India just before the pandemic hit. So it's very timely. So let me begin by expressing my thoughts and prayers are with you in Hyderabad and throughout India through this terrible time of the pandemic. It stretches people emotionally, physically. We've lost friends in the United States to the pandemic, and I'm sure that some of you have had tragedies in your family. So my prayers and thoughts are with you as you work through this terrible, terrible time. My premise is that at least in the United States, we've hit the tipping point, and the economy and society is starting to open up again, and that will eventually happen in India. But it's been very interesting as we've hit the tipping point in the pandemic in the United States. As we hit the tipping point in the pandemic, then what's happened is pent-up demand that has been building for the last year and a half or so is now unleashed, and the economy is beginning, as reflected in the stock market, but not in employment records, because people are not so optimistic about the ability of the Biden administration to create jobs. It's almost impossible to, housing prices are going up. It's almost impossible to get a contractor to come and build a house. The service sector is up. Most of the sectors are just exploding, and it's going to be a lot of companies and a lot of sectors are struggling to keep up to meet the demands that have been pent up over the last year and a half. So it's been very interesting. A second thing is as we go through these materials, I like to think that I'm an empiricist. That is, if you go down to the local bookstore, you'll find lots and lots of stuff that's been written about HR, about leadership, about people, about organization, corporate cultures. You find lots of stuff in the bookshelves, but very little of that is based upon large-scale empirical research. Somebody has a wonderful experience in one company and they write a wonderful book and everybody feels inspired. But that's one company, that's not a large-scale research. So as we go through my materials, I like to think I'm an empiricist. That is, at the University of Michigan, we have the largest database in the world on HR professionals. We have now, including what we think is the largest database in India, although that changes from time to time. We have over 120,000 people on our database that we've gathered over almost 30 years, a little bit more than 30 years. And so in that database, we've asked the question, what is it that HR professionals do? Well, there's a lot of surveys that ask, what do HR professionals do? And a lot of companies have their HR competency models, their HR profile models, and so forth. That's one issue. The second issue, though, is what HR practices are occurring that have business impact, that impact business, and have they statistically connected these practices to empirical research, to business outcomes. And almost no research that I've seen outside of our own makes that connection between the HR practices and business outcomes, especially if you break down those outcomes by different stakeholders, by the value that HR creates for external customers, for employees, for shareholders, for leaders, for communities, and so forth. So, so we like to think at University of Michigan, we've connected the HR practices to business outcomes. But then, even if we know what the business outcomes are, if everybody's doing it, then it still doesn't create competitive differentiation. It's something you have to do. But what we're interested in is which HR practices are happening that have impact that are not being done generally, because that's the sweet spot of competitive advantage. Because if everybody's doing it, then it's competitive parity, it's not competitive advantage. So we asked 3 questions of our research. What is happening? What has impact? And what is scarce? Because we want things that have impact but are scarce, that is, not a lot of people are doing, because that's the sweet spot of competitive advantage. So that's kind of my logic, and you're going to see that logic played out, especially in the primary data that I'm going to use to build this presentation. So before we begin, I'm going to ask you to all join in and mentally, and if you can do this very quickly, if we were all live together and we were all together in the same room, we could do this live, but I'm going to have to do some guessing. So here's 3 questions I'm going to ask you. What is the rate of change in your market ecosystem today compared to, say, 5 to 7 years ago? Are things, well, this is kind of a stupid question given what we just talked about. Are things happening really fast? 4, 3, 2, 1, are they really slow? What's the rate of change and challenge that's occurring in your market environment? It's just, and obviously things have gone nuts. So now I've asked this question to over 3,000 people in the last year and a half. And this is the first answer is about, it comes out to be about a 4.3, 4.4. Then the next question is, in the context of this rate of change, how fast are leaders making the big decisions? Are they really fast? Or are they kind of slow relative to that rate of change? And think about what would your answer be? About 3,000 people have said the rate of change is about, how fast the leaders make decisions, about a 3.3, 3.4. So you can see there's a disconnect there. And then the last question is, so we see how fast the world's changing, how fast leaders are making decisions. Then the last question is, how fast does the total organization respond? And how fast they respond means how fast they develop they change their technical capabilities, their mindset, their culture, what they focus on, their collaborative efforts, their innovative spirit. How fast does the total organization respond relative to this rate of change of 4.3, 4.4? Now, I don't know what your answer is, but this is the answer of about 3,000 people. It's about a 2.1, 2.2. So you can see that that's a problem. The world is changing faster than leaders are making decisions, faster than the total organization responds. So the question is, where do you want that? So you see the organization response is about 2.2. The question is, along this scale, where do you want that response of the organization to be? Where do you want this 2 to be relative to this 4.3? And the answer is, you want the organization not to be in a responsive mode. You want your organization to be in a proactive mode. You want the organization to be in the world of creating turbulence, creating change for its competitors, instead of simply responding to change. That's what I like to think about, that 2.2 to a 5.2. That is the fundamental HR challenge. How do we create an organization with its technical capabilities, its culture, its values, that will create change instead of simply respond to change. That's, I think, the fundamental HR challenge. And we've seen through coronavirus, with the economy's in trouble, we used to meet together. Now we're having meetings like today where we're meeting through internet. We're seeing in the United States, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world, social activism has exploded in the context of the coronavirus problems. So there's lots of stuff that's going on. But someday, as we talked about, the pandemic will go down. And therefore, what is the fundamental drivers of competitive landscape that will occur that have been driving the economy before coronavirus and will continue to drive economic value added as the pandemic subsides? And it's clear that we are in the age of information. That is where, when we think about the proliferation of information, technological innovation that results in shorter product life cycles, greater global competition for labor, capital, information, ideology, demographics are changing. All of that, all of the sectors are morphing. Let me give you a quick example of sectors morphing. To some degree, General Motors is trying to build cars, and it was doing okay. And then all of a sudden, Google decides it's going to build cars. And all of a sudden, General said, whoa, wait. So what they thought was a non-competitor now becoming competitors in many, many sectors. National geographies are morphing. One of the most interesting statistics is there are more CEOs around the world outside of India who have Indian heritage that are being promoted than from any other nationality. So India is a net exporter of basic executive leadership talents. Very interesting to see that happening. So India is expanding in terms of leadership capability outside of India. And at the same time, some geographies are shrinking. The United States under Trump was kind of shrinking. Europe is shrinking. And so some economies are expanding, as we saw with India and its leadership, but so is China trying to expand, but some sectors. So you put all that together and you overlay sector complexity and change with geographical complexity and change, and you find moving targets. And the ability of organizations to compete within that context is contingent on the extent to which they can access, analyze, and act on critical information about these changes. Now, I don't have time to go through what's going on in the world of information entirely, but there are a couple of interesting statistics. One is one of my favorite statistics. More than 1 billion transistors are now on Earth for every person on Earth. So for each person on Earth, there's a billion transistors that are floating. So the point is, you don't have to go and look for transistors. The transistors are looking for you. So the point is, there's an explosion in information that's being driven by transistors. The speed of information processing. In 1964, Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, stated that the speed of information processing would double every 18 months. That's how it's become popularized as Moore's law. So that was stated in 1964. Now it's the year 2021. Can you hear me? Or is there a problem?
No, sir. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
You can go ahead, sir.
Yeah, somebody. Okay. So the question is, now that's 64. This law was stated. Now it's the year 2021. So what's the increase in the speed of information process? What's the % increase in the speed of computer information processing? What do you think that number is? Just think about a number. What doubles every 18 months, and that was started in 1964. So what do you think the number is? What's the % increase? Well, I did the calculations actually last night, and according to my calculations, the % increase is in the speed of information since 1964 is 42 billion % increase in the speed of information processing on the space of a computer chip. So it's just gone nuts. And for a while, we thought Moore's law was dead, that we'd reached the physical limits of a chip. But now in the last 2 or 3 years, quantum computing has become not just theoretically possible, but quantum computers are being developed in 87 organizations around the world trying to construct quantum computers. And when that happens, the speed is going to quadruple exponentially again. So the rate of speed of information process. And as a result, we see all this stuff. I'm just going to give you one. So on every internet minute, this is kind of a fun website. Probably some of you have seen it. In 1 minute on the internet, there's 404,000 hours of internet of viewing of Netflix that are going on. So my point of raising that issue is, don't worry, this will be over in about an hour and a half, and you can all get back to watching your Netflix. Because I mean, the number of hours that are spent every minute on the internet, people viewing Netflix is just nuts. And we see the same thing, same trend with YouTube, WhatsApp, Amazon, LinkedIn, and so forth. Now, finally, for those of you who are really HR geeks, that is, you really believe in the potential of HR to impact, and you're interested in the intellectual richness that is possible through HR, this is one of the most interesting slides I'm going to give. All of the Nobel Prize winners, every one of them who have addressed organization issues over the last 50 years, have done so through a lens of information. That is, the way that they explain how organizations function effectively and efficiently to create competitive advantage are viewed through a lens of information logic. Herbert Simon was the first, or wasn't the first, but certainly one of the most visible. Then Taylor, Ronald Coase, Oliver Williamson, Kenneth Arrow, all those folks that have won Nobel Prizes who have addressed information, or who have addressed organization dynamics, have done so through the lens of information. So in the midst of all of that intellectual richness, where has HR been? What role has HR played in the midst of these fundamental challenge in the explosion of information technology and in the best thinkers in the world about organization thinking about information? Where has HR been? Well, we're going to look at the statistics in a minute. It's not terrific. HR has been way behind the curve, not just in applying HR information, not just in applying information analytics to itself, but also developing the organization capability to help companies compete in the information age. Let me say that again, because that's really important. So, you know, we've had kind of a flavor of the month. What are the HR metrics? How are we going to apply information logic to HR? That's one logic. We need to do that. That's fine. And we'll talk about the impact that has on business performance in a minute. But the more critical issue is, in the information age, information becomes a fundamental source of competitive advantage. It becomes an organizational capability. Well, let me ask you the question. What department should be the best thinkers in the company about organizational capability? That's us. We should, HR folks should be the best thinkers about how to design, create, and implement organization capability. That's what we do in HR. But somehow, the idea of framing information management as an organizational capability, we haven't embraced that. That's something that IT people do. That's something that marketing does. That's something. But if you frame it as an organization capability, then we should be right at the center of thinking about information, and we're not. And let me give you the statistics. So, and there's a reason for it. Let me give you a quick example. We agree we're in the people business, right? We all agree we're in the people business. But we have a fundamentally flawed view of what we mean by the people business. Now, there's two groups of people that are critical for business success. There's two groups. There's not one, there's two. One group is our employees and leaders, okay? and those are important. But there's another group of people who are equally important. One might argue, given the criteria, they're more important, and that is customers and owners. Now, the problem is we in HR, we say, well, we're in the people business, but we're only talking about, oh, when we say people, we only mean these people, employees. We don't mean these people. That's not what we mean in HR. We mean by people. So if we use the term people and say we're in the people business, we're only 50% right, because we're only talking about the employee half, not the customers and owners half. And so now I don't know about the University of Hyderabad, but at the University of Michigan, 50% is failing. So we're 50% right. When we say we're in the people business, we only focus on half of it. And the fundamental challenge for HR is to really be in the people business, which is to figure out how to connect our people on the inside with people on the outside. And that connection can only occur as we shake hands with the customer and owners on the outside through information. How to access, what information to access, how to analyze it, and how to utilize it. And that's something we're going to see in a minute. We don't have the statistics to do. Now, okay, now, as I indicated, at Michigan, we have a huge database. And one of the things we've looked at is all the different practices that HR departments can be involved in. And we factor analyze, you know, you all know what factor analysis is. These are not conceptually generated categories. These are statistically generated categories. And we found there were 4 statistical categories of HR department activities. One is called employee performance HR practices. And that's a combination of measurement, rewards, and training. And that's what we call employee performance, measurement, rewards, and training. The next factor is what we call integrated HR practices. And we call it integrated HR practice because the critical issue is how do you bring together an integration of strategy, culture and capabilities, and HR practices so that the HR practices that create and sustain the culture and organization capabilities are required to execute the strategy that is based upon an understanding of the market environment. Okay, so we call that integrated because the key issue there is to integrate those 3, strategy, culture, and HR practices so that they integrate together. The next category, let me drop down to the bottom, is HR analytics. That's kind of flavor of the month now in HR. You can go to almost any HR forum or association meeting in the world, and you're going to have a bunch of people are going to talk about HR analytics, which is a good thing. That is how you apply technology, information analytics to HR issues. How do you measure and track HR performance? Use HR analytics to improve decision making, and so forth. That's stuff we do on the apply HR logic or information logic to HR. The next category is HR's role in information management. Now that's different. That's not applying information logic to HR. It's helping the organization to develop the organization capability to apply information logic to the total organization for fundamental competitive advantage. So those are the 4 categories we're able to statistically identify. And we're going to talk about. So the question I'm going to ask, I'd like you to think about it. Could it be the case that these different 4 categories of HR department practices might vary in terms of their impact on different stakeholders? That is, might it be the case that one of these practice areas might have more impact on some stakeholders, HR stakeholders, than on other stakeholders? And the answer is absolutely yes. So before we do that, let's look at our stakeholders. We have regulators, investors, external buying customers, employees, short-term financials, communities, and line managers. And the question was asked of, again, about 3,000 people, on which of the following must your firm focus to be optimally successful over the long run? What do we need? Where does our line of sight, where is our attention need to be focused? And based upon, again, the research we've done over the last several months, external buying customers become number one. We need to understand that stakeholder more than anything else. Then employees, second. Then tied for third are investors and short-term financial results. Fourth are line managers. Then fifth, communities, and finally a distant sixth are regulators. But obviously, the priorities of these stakeholders can change from industry to industry and maybe even company to company. But in general, I think we would agree the most important issue for companies to understand is what the markets require, so you know what products and services to provide so that you make money. Now let's connect these practice areas to these stakeholders and see what we come up with. Okay, this is probably one of the most important charts that's been generated in the last 5 years in the HR world, literally around the world. Okay, so here, along the rows, we have those 4 HR practice areas: employee performance, measurement, rewards, and training. Strategically integrated HR practice areas: strategy, culture, and the collective HR practice. HR analytics, which we talked about, and finally HR's role in information management, which means HR's role in accessing, analyzing, and helping make sure that information is fully utilized. So it's HR's role in creating information as an organization capability. Now, these are the mean scores. And what we do best in HR, this is a 5-point scale. What we do best in HR is employee performance, measurement, rewards, and training. This 5-point scale. Then there's a drop down to strategically integrated HR practices, HR analytics, and finally the worst thing we do, which I hinted at earlier, is to understand and leverage organization or information as an organization capability, which HR is playing a role in creating and sustaining. So that's the worst thing we do, understandably. And yet it's probably the single most important trend in the world of business today that we talked about earlier, is we're living in the information age. So what is HR's role going to be? Not in applying information logic to ourselves, but creating information logic as a fundamental competitive advantage for the organization. Okay, now along the top then are the stakeholders we just talked about. Short-term business performance, customers, owners, communities, regulators, line managers, employees. These numbers represent, and I'll say it slowly and carefully, represents the percent of value for each of these stakeholders that is created for each of these HR practice areas. For example, if short-term business performance is your most important focus, then then 44% of the value that HR creates for short-term business performance is in measurement, rewards, and training. And then it trails off, and then it trails down to these other 3. Now, if line managers or employees, on the other hand, are seen as your most important stakeholder, then strategically integrated HR practice areas are critical. That is, to make sure there's an integration between strategy, culture, and your collective HR practices that again create and sustain the culture that then creates and sustains competitive advantage in executing your strategy. And that's what these numbers say, that practice area at 57 and 56% have more impact on creating value for employees and line managers than anything else. Okay, let's come back up here. So we've talked about a couple of 3 of our stakeholders, but we haven't yet talked about the most important stakeholders, which are employees, which is external customers, that's number 1, and then investors, which are number 3. So let's look at now to create value for customers and owners. Now this is external customers, that's not internal customers. We should never use that term, internal customers. It confuses the world. Or internal customers. External customers, if HR is going to be involved in creating value for the company by creating value for external customers, then it would be focusing on creating and sustaining information management as an organizational capability. 45% of the value that HR can create for customers comes about by HR's role in helping to orchestrate the flow of information. Then it drops off to the other three categories. So depending on which of your stakeholders is most important, has important implications for which of the 4 HR practice areas you would focus on. So that's a critical finding. You can't just say, bundle all of your stakeholders together and say, well, we're just going to bundle them all together and hope that something we do in HR is relevant for all of them. That's simply a fool's errand. So with the assumption today, based upon my charge, that we're going to create competitive advantage that is sustainable, not short-term, that's this one, the short-term business, but is sustainable in creating sustainable value for our customers, then we want to be focusing on HR's role in information management. So based upon that, I had the opportunity, since this research came out about 4 years ago, I've had the opportunity of visiting with some of the best managed companies and some of the lead intellectual thinkers in this area in the world, and you recognize a lot of these folks and companies. So I had the opportunity of spending sometimes a couple of hours with them, sometimes an entire day or more, talking to them about how they think about information and the role that HR can play. Based upon our discussion with these folks and based upon the data that we had from our research at Michigan, we were able to identify that there are 3 basic categories of where HR can potentially play a role in the orchestration of information as a competitive advantage. We're going to talk about each one of these now for the next 20 minutes or so. First is how we acquire information. So I'm going to ask you, the second is how we analyze the information, third, how we apply it. So I'm going to ask you in your mind, what might a potential role that HR would play in acquiring competitive information that would help your company to win? What role might HR play in the acquisition of critical information? Not marketing, but HR. Very interesting question. Second question is, what role might HR play in analyzing that information that we've acquired? Analyzing includes prioritizing, interpreting, debating, and sharing. And finally, what role might HR play in making sure that we're applying the information that's been accurately analyzed through our acquisition of critical information that is necessary for our sustainable success? So what role might HR play? Now, if you're if that's not intuitive, that's fine, because you recall our research up here said that that's the worst thing that we do. So, but I want you to think, but there are some spectacular examples of companies that are actually playing an important role in these. Before I leave this slide, there's one other factor, one other consideration. The relationship among these 3, acquiring, analyzing, and applying, is a multiplicative factor we found. That is, if any one of these 3 goes to 0, the whole equation goes to 0. For example, if we acquire and apply information, but we analyzed it correctly, then the whole equation goes to 0. If we analyze and apply, but we don't have the right information in the front end, the equation goes to 0. If we acquire and analyze the right information, we don't apply it, then the equation goes to 0. So this is a multiplicative relationship. They all need to integrate and work together. Nevertheless, there are some examples we're going to talk about now of some best practices. So for one aspect of acquiring information is, do we explore? Are we intellectually curious? Do we find out what's there and not what we think is there? Let me give HUL in Hindustan Unilever Limited, as you know, does some very interesting things. This will be a practice you all know, but you haven't probably thought about it in terms of an organizational context. As you know, in their management trainee programs, and I'm sure all of you know this story, HUL hires some of the seeks to hire some of the best students from the best universities that have come out of the best universities, come out of the best high schools, and that means their families frequently have had the money to send them to the best primary schools, the best elementary schools, the best secondary schools, and so they get into the best universities. So these kids, some of the management trainees from Unilever come from some of the best, some reasonably well-to-do families. That's all well and good, except who's buying HUL's products? There are people that are scattered throughout the middle class throughout India, the middle class and lower classes throughout India. That's the customer. So you have this huge disconnect between its customers and its future leaders. So the challenge that we talked about earlier is, how do you connect the employees? How does HUL connect the employees with its customers? Well, and you know, one of the main practices they use is they take their management trainees who come out of these usually somewhat well-to-do families, and they ship them out to the villages. And these management trainees will interact with the villagers. They'll stay with them for a while. They'll come to know their lifestyle. But how long do they do that? When I give the following statistic in the United States, people are just stunned. They can't believe it. And some of you will be flummoxed too. So how long do they ask these kind of well-to-do, maybe, I don't say they're spoiled, but they're well-to-do kids, how long are they going to expect them to go out and live in a village where they're going to sleep on a dirt floor? They're going to interact with people they've never interacted before in their lives. They're going to learn their lifestyle, their culture, their values, what their needs are for their lifestyle. How long do they expect these kids to stay out in these villages? And that, it varies a little bit from year to year, but the range is from anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months. People in the United States are stunned by that. But okay, so that's the statistics. So what happens during those 6 months? They learn not just the technical requirements of their customers, they learn the hearts and minds of their customers. So that when they go back to headquarters, they start talking about what the trends they're seeing, what the needs are